Welcome to Awaken the Mind, the NLP and Hypnosis Guide, hosted by David Juhas.
You're listening to Awaken the Mind, the NLP and Hypnosis Guide, a podcast that inspires the curious to the professional to discover meaningful content and pursue their passions. My name is David Juhas, and I'm a master NLP practitioner and hypnotist, best known for losing over 100 pounds and running 6 marathons in 2 years. And I'm sitting down with hypnotists, NLP practitioners, and coaches to talk about their process, the lessons they've learned, and how to make an impact in the lives of others. Our guest today is Leela Sinha, and she is an author, speaker, and executive coach with a background in tech, bodywork, parish ministry, and sexuality education, among other things. Z believes that when people have to mute who they are, it's bad for their health, their communities, and their bottom line. That could be gender, sexual orientation, race, and culture, or something more amorphous, like being too much. In 2016, Z wrote, "You're Not Too Much," and shortly afterward, founded the Intensives Institute at San Francisco, celebrating those big personalities and the companies that hire them. Z is most excited by the possibilities in tech and business when they overlap with diversity and inclusion. And please give our guest today a warm welcome, Leela Sinha. Welcome, Leela.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I am so happy that you are here today, and we just saw each other a little bit ago.
We did. It was an amazing experience.
Tell me about your experience in New York and the Melissa Tears experience.
Melissa was amazing. She reminded me actually of my New Testament scholar professor from seminary. She, my professor in seminary would, whip out a Greek language, ancient Greek language copy of the Bible, flip through it, and read from it into English, like just on the fly, and then would pause to be like, there's this one word, and usually they translate it this way, but when they translate it that way, it doesn't really make sense in the larger context of how that word is used, and she would go on and on and on. And I was like, this is just like being in New Testament class, only we're talking about hypnosis.
And I'm thinking probably less cuss words in...
More than you would expect. Clergy are also human, and my New Testament professor isn't clergy, she's just a scholar.
Gotcha. I want to get to know you more, and a lot of really cool, exciting things to talk about. How about when you were growing up? Tell me about what it was like for you growing up. What were your hobbies or interests?
Oh, wow. So I grew up in southwestern Connecticut. My father is from India, and my mom is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed California girl. So I tell people that right from the start, I was between, right? My identity and my experience of the world has never been monolithic, because, I opened my eyes as an infant, and already there were two people of two different races, two different linguistic backgrounds, two different cultural backgrounds, and that's what I was born into. And I had a very kind of stable childhood in all of the material ways. I went to the same elementary, middle, and high school the whole time. I lived in the same house the whole time. My parents are still married. So in many ways, my growing up was very consistent. And then it got completely chaotic. After I graduated from high school and went to college in South Central Minnesota. So shout out to the Midwestern experience. And after college, I started moving, and I moved and moved and moved and moved and moved. So earlier, before we began, you asked me, where was I before I was in Maine, which is where I was before I was in California. And the answer is all over the place.
Do you have a favorite place what are some of the favorite places that you've experienced?
My very favorite place is Portugal. I loved being in Portugal. I was in Portugal for 13 weeks for massage therapy training. And it was a great training, but it was also just a phenomenal experience. I found Portugal really warm and welcoming. And I had a really profound experience there. It was the first time I was there when I was 2011, so like 37. And it was the first time in my life that people treated me like I was local.
Oh, wow.
Everywhere I've lived, people want to know where I'm from. because they assume I can't be from wherever I am.
Wow.
So imagine that people just assume that you're foreign to the place where you are until you're 37. You're in a country where you have no blood ties at all, and people start treating you like you belong there.
Sounds very welcoming.
It was. It was also just, it was a deep shock because I didn't know what I was missing until I had it.
When you were growing up, did you have different role models? Any books that you like to read?
So when I was 7, my favorite book and my favorite character was Robin Hood. I wanted to grow up and be Robin Hood. And I joke that in many ways I have grown up to be Robin Hood. But that's where that was really the moral foundation for me. I went to Unitarian Universalist Church my entire life, but my moral foundation was really formed as much in the books that I read and the stories that I immersed myself in. I was an avid reader. I read everything I could get my hands on. I would go to the library and get this stack of books that went from my hands to my chin on Saturday morning, and then I would just read all weekend, and I'd be done with my stack by the end of the weekend. We'd go back to the library and do it all again. My parents were very supportive of my reading habit, very supportive of education, and I think that really helped shape my interest in words and reading. I think they were a little perplexed and possibly disappointed that I didn't turn out to be a mathematician or an engineer, since one of my parents is a mathematician and one of my parents is an engineer, but can't have everything.
Well, thank goodness you turned out to be the unique person that you are, not somebody else's person.
Yeah, that's always been me. There's a funny story about me. When I was 2, my mom wanted me to drink my milk, and I was sitting at the table, and we were kind of in a pitched battle about it, like you sometimes get with 2-year-olds. And she finally said to me, "You can either drink your milk quietly or go to your room." And I looked at the milk, and I looked at her, and I looked at the milk, and I looked at her, and I looked at the milk, and I looked at her, and I said, "I think I'll have the orange juice."
Oh.
And that's emblematic of who I am. I didn't hear that story until I was well into adulthood, and I wish I had heard it earlier, because it would have been like, well, at least I'm consistent.
So what led you into the work that you do now? Was there a point? I mean, it sounds like you had a lot of journey, a lot of places, a lot of learnings. And
a lot of paths. Well, I was Unitarian Universalist from the beginning, and Unitarian Universalism really impacts all of my life. It's a liberal religion, and so people often say, "Oh, well, you can believe anything you want," but that's not really true. You have to believe something that's in consonance with what you find to be true, and so you have to go deep inside yourself and find a truth, and then let that inform what you end up believing. And that can change, and that's okay. We don't have like a theology that you have to fit into. So it's a really interesting faith tradition to grow up in. But where I'm going with this is that being a deeply faithful person is something that people usually think is incompatible with being a very liberal person. And yet here I am. And so when people say, well, why do you do the things you do, or how did you end up acting the way you act? It was Robin Hood, but it was also the church. You know, we believe in people's inherent worth and dignity. We believe in justice and equity and compassion. And we believe that everybody should have a voice, and that those voices should be heard. We believe in the good of the whole. We believe in the interconnectedness of people. And so all of that influences how I feel compelled to live in the world. Like, I can't be in the world and be careless about how I impact other people. Like, I just can't. Like, that's just not a thing. And so, and I was really interested in brains and the way people thought from a really young age. I think I first said I wanted to be a psychologist when I was maybe 10 or 11. And I didn't end up becoming a psychologist, but I've done an enormous amount of study around brains and change work and neurobiology now, which is super exciting. I also had some hard times in my childhood and growing up that made me really interested in how to get better. And so some of this was, how do I solve my own issues? And some of this was, what is the therapist I'm working with doing? And some of this was, oh my God, brains are just amazing and fascinating. And some of it was, I want to help the world. So all of that, I ended up, I majored in American Studies, which is an interdisciplinary major. Remember I said I was between? I'm
Yeah.
between it. Like everywhere you look in my life, you'll find between. So I majored in American Studies in college, and then I it took about 5 years to see what I wanted to do grad school in, and ended up going to grad school to seminary. And so I was in Chicago for 2 years for seminary, and then I was in Ottawa for 2 years for field work, and then I went to my first parish placement, which was in Portland, Oregon, and then my second parish placement, which was in Maine. And after those 2 parishes, I realized that in general, I moved too fast for a congregation.
How so?
Congregations are composed of people, and people, as many of your listeners, I know you said you have coaches and NLP practitioners, right? People tend to resist change, right? Brains like things to stay the way they were. Neuronal pathways like to be, we like the superhighway neuronal pathways instead of the, like, I have to bushwhack this one with a machete neuronal pathways, right? Like, we like the well-established patterns, and we like to stay in the well-established patterns. And so I go into a congregation and they say, well, we're struggling with this and we're struggling with that. And I say, oh, well, it looks like this, and this are the things that need to change. Are you on board? And they say, yeah. And I say, okay, let's go. And they're like, oh,
we gotta have a meeting.
Do a study and have a vote. And I'm like, you said you wanted to change. This is how we get you there. And so it becomes a point of conflict, and the congregation tends to come away from that conflict with the sense that I don't love them, which is unfortunate because it's not true. I love them very much. I love them so much I can't let them sit where they are, especially since they asked me to come to change that thing.
Yeah.
Right. And most people aren't ready for that. Most people aren't comfortable with that. And most institutions are not prepared to change that fast.
How an environment is set up in a certain way, and trying to change the environment can, if the environment doesn't change, then the elements in the environment will change. It'll expel.
Yeah, I mean, so what's interesting about that is that ties in really closely with systems theory. Are you familiar with family systems theory?
I'm not, no.
Ooh, you have to read about family systems theory. There's so much interesting stuff in there. And I know that you're the kind of brain geek that wants to know about it. So systems theory was originally developed about families, and then they discovered that it really applies to any system of humans interacting over a period of time. So originally it was families, and then it was congregations. There was a rabbi who expanded the field of systems theory to include congregations, religious congregations, and most recently I've seen Harvard and Stanford business schools rebranding it as systems thinking for the business world, as though they invented it. So systems theory says that a system wants to remain in stasis, basically, and that if the system if any element in the system changes, it forces everybody else to change. And so the place that we see this, like one of the classic examples people give, is in an alcoholic family system. So you have a family, one person is the alcoholic, they're the identified patient, right? And that person who's alcoholic, everybody complains about them and everybody blames them for pretty much everything that's going wrong in the system. And then finally the alcoholic hits rock bottom and gets dry somehow, gets sober. And so the alcoholic gets sober and maybe starts seeing a therapist and starts doing some of the inner work that goes along with really addressing the root causes of addiction. And suddenly the whole family that they live with starts acting out in such a way as to pressure them to start drinking again. And, it's things that you're like, I don't understand why this is happening. Like, people will leave open bottles of booze hanging around the house, even though they know that that's not supportive, right? Like, and for the longest time, family therapists and other people who worked with family systems were completely perplexed by this. Because they were like, you said you wanted this person to change. They've changed. They're doing the thing. You need to support them. And it was almost like the system couldn't help itself. Well, that's because the system as a whole, the way that humans interact, creates pressure to maintain itself. And if I'm not the alcoholic and I think that the whole problem is in the alcoholic or the person with the addiction, I shouldn't use the alcoholic because that's deprecated language, but if you think that the whole problem is in the person with the addiction and you're not prepared to change yourself, You didn't sign up to change you. You signed up for them to change and solve the whole problem. So if you don't see yourself as part of the problem, then you don't see yourself as needing to change. And then you just get angry and resentful that you have to change. But all of that happens in that subconscious place that all of us like to play in, right? The hypnotists and the NLP people, right? It all happens in the back, sort of back recesses of your brain. It doesn't happen up front where you can analyze it. And so it can be very challenging to shift a system, whether it's a family system with somebody who's got an addiction, or whether it's a congregation that has a history of undergiving financially, or whether, whatever it is, the system doesn't want to change. They see one element as the problem, and if they can't make one of their own that problem, and then a newcomer comes in, as in a congregation where the minister might arrive into an existing system, the minister is clearly the problem, even if they've been having this problem for 200 years.
That is really fascinating. What was the name of the book again, or the reference that you gave?
You should research family systems theory. I can't remember who originated it, but if you find it on Wikipedia, it'll give you the places to look. And then there's a rabbi who applied it the book is called Generation to Generation, the one that talks about it in congregational systems. But I can't remember the rabbi's name. It's a thick, dense book. It's an academic book, so be prepared. Yeah. But you can chew on it a little at a time.
Yeah. And that's like an NLP, the levels of change, the very bottom level is the environment. And the context that I had heard it in was around alcohol and drug addiction. And when the person is changing their behaviors, then when they hang around the people that they used to hang around with, they get rejected. And then there's this loss of, these people that are their friends, kicking them out of the friendship,
Yeah, I mean, that's another piece of it, but that's a slightly different piece of the larger context question. If you're in a pattern with these people and you all, do something together, you all go bowling together, and then you're like, nah, I don't like bowling anymore. They're going to be like, well, why are we hanging around with you? We like to bowl.
Well, thank you for diving into that. That was a little surprise I wasn't even expecting, but I enjoyed. Thank you.
I have a head full of things like that.
Perfect. We are in the right place today. When was the very first trainings that you dove into?
This was my first hypnosis training. This 8-day immersive, like both feet in, which is classic intensiveness. We'll talk about intensiveness later, I'm sure. But that's classic for me, is to be like, I'm sort of interested in this. Let me take a professional level clinical class.
Well, in your ministry training, though, then there was probably working with people and challenge.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so there we go.
So when you go to seminary, they are teaching you some things that are like administrative skills, right? How to read a church budget, very important. I'm in a congregational tradition where each congregation kind of operates independently. So, how to read a church budget and how to run a meeting and all that stuff. And simultaneously, they're teaching you things like pastoral care and counseling and how to preach. And the places where those things intersect are, of course, interesting and kind of mushy, because that's what life is, right? Humans are interesting and kind of mushy. And we don't like sharp barriers. We just, you can try and stick humans into boxes and they just come out all over the place. Like those like the octopods that are recently, they have those films of them on the internet where they're like, yeah, sure, I'm in a box. And they like reach out and flip the switch and crawl across, so yeah, you start out with this kind of mushy background. And even before that, I was the kid that talked to other kids about how they were feeling. And then when I left seminary and I did, parish ministry for a few years, that's full of that kind of thing. But it also got me really curious about change work, precisely because of the stuff I was talking about just now. The congregation would say they wanted something and I would go to help that happen. And then I would run into this wall of resistance. And I was like, what is going on? This makes no sense. And simultaneously, of course, I'm observing in myself, like, I have to write a sermon. I don't want to write my sermon. Why do I not want to write my sermon? I love to write. I love to preach. Like, why is this a problem? Why am I running into resistance? So I became fascinated by these concepts of resistance. Yeah. And simultaneously, I was having some relationship issues with some past relationships that I'm not in anymore. And again, I was fascinated. Clearly, we both love each other. Clearly, we both want to be in a relationship. And yet, we're in this pitched battle conflict. What is going on? How do brains work? So I got super deep in psychology, even though I didn't end up getting that PhD in psychology I wanted. I ended up super deep in books about all this stuff. And then during the times when I was seeing therapists, they would say something and I'd be like off to the internet or off to the library to research the thing. So I had an avocational interest in this from a very early point. And then toward what turned out to be the end of my parish ministry, I, although I didn't know it at the time, I took coaching training with the Coaches Training Institute, which is based out here, but I was taking it in New York. And so there was another set of tools and another perspective to layer on top of what I learned in seminary, to layer on top of what I learned from my own research, to layer on top of what I learned from my therapist, right? So, and I was like, ooh, this is fast and efficient and forward looking. I really like this. Like, compared to therapy, it was really exciting. And so I started just accumulating tools, right? And it was after my coaches training that a lot of the current neuroscience came visible, right? That we started to really understand neuroplasticity the way that we understand it now. I had known about hypnosis. I had known about NLP, but I also knew that we didn't really have any way of explaining the mechanisms. And so I was maybe a little skeptical. Pardon the dog drinking in the background.
That's all right.
And so I was, and the more I learned, the more excited I was, because I'm a geek like that. And so I went into it. And then I met a friend who was into hypnosis and I was a little, because I have some social anxiety. And so I tend to be a little shy about, like, call up random practitioner, tell them I want a random session for, I don't even know really why. Like, I think that's a hard barrier for a lot of potential clients, is like, all right, some people think this is really weird and some people think this is really woo. And also, I don't even know what to ask for because I don't really understand the scope of what's possible. And I don't want to over ask, right? I don't want to ask for the moon and then have you laugh at me if you're my practitioner and be like, oh, ha, 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 yeah, we can't do that. When I met this friend who was into hypnosis, I was like, okay, well, and it took me a long time to ask him. And then I was like, I'm curious, but I don't even know what it's like. Can you put me in trance? Can I just have that experience? And he's like, sure, no problem. Get comfortable. And like, poof, he put me in trance. And we had an interesting experience because it turns out that I don't do convincers. So he was like, your arm is levitating. I'm like, no, it's not. And so for a while I was like, am I really going into trance? Right? Like, that's the problem with convincers, is that if they don't work, then you end up spending all this time spinning in your head about, like, what if this isn't working, right? Yeah. So that's one of the things I really appreciated about Melissa's approach, that she's like, maybe you're just really relaxed, or maybe you're in trance, and it doesn't really matter whether you're relaxed or in trance, just so long as you're here with me. So just stay here with me and follow my voice, right? But to me, that's a much lower pressure. There's no pressure to perform. And then he introduced me to Ericksonian techniques. And of course, I have this, when I was 10, I said I wanted to be a writer. Words are my first thing. And so the idea that you could use narrative structure to draw people into trance, I was like, I recognize that. I write stories, I write sermons, I preach. Like, this is all very familiar territory. And in fact, my friend was like, you're probably doing a lot of this already. You just don't know that that's what you're doing. Yeah. And, when I got my Reiki training, I had the same philosophy that I did about hypnosis, which is, if I'm sort of half using this anyway, I have a responsibility to understand what I'm doing. Right. And so that was the other piece. I was fascinated, and I have all these ideas about interesting ways to use hypnosis, but also I would feel a responsibility. If I've stumbled into it, I feel a responsibility to finish learning it and not just like randomly thwack around with my sword and hope I don't kill anyone.
Well, I can tell that you're passionate about this because you just lit up as you're talking about this, and that is exciting to see you light up like that. So thank you for sharing that. Tell me about your book. Your book is You're Not Too Much. Hey, there.
Not too much. There it is. So the book came about simultaneously with the concepts that are in the book. When I was, it was 2014, end of 2014, and I had a severe back injury that at first we didn't know what it was, and then we discovered that I had ruptured my L3 disc idiopathically. Poof.
Ouch.
It just happened. Yeah, and it was the kind of injury that, because it was my L3, it affected my left quadricep fairly heavily, and so I couldn't stand, I couldn't walk, I couldn't squat. I was crawling around my house. You know, I had a friend come over and put my microwave on the floor so that I could heat things up. I lived alone. I mean, you know, these are the risks of living outside of community or with your community all far away. I was fortunate to have a friend who lived only an hour away and could come and fix things up for me. But I started thinking, and you know how it is when you have to lie on your back for 3 months. Like, at first you think about all the good things, and then you think about all the bad things, and like you can't escape it because there's literally nothing else you can do. So the same friend who put my microwave on the floor came over with a boom mic stand and mounted a clamp for my phone right over my face as I was lying in bed, and then handed me a Bluetooth keyboard and said, "Here, at least you can write and you can be on the internet while you're lying flat on your back," because I couldn't roll over, like couldn't do anything. And so while I was lying there and thinking these thoughts, I was like, you know, all these people who are too much, like I'm too much, like what happened in my life? All these people have told me I'm too much, but it's not just me, because it's also a lot of my friends and a lot of my best clients are too much. And so what is this too much? Like, is that like, yes, I know I'm the common factor. I'm a coach. I'm a trained coach. Like, of course I'm the common factor. If everybody says I'm too much, I'm the thing that's too much, right? But then really, like, what is this too much? Because there's got to be something else going on here. And I realized that we didn't have any way to talk about this purported too muchness without being pejorative. We didn't have any language that just accepted it. We didn't have any language that was even value neutral, much less complimentary. And I was like, well, that's a problem. So I was like, what's the word for us? And I eventually decided that the word that I was going to use was intensives as a noun. So we're intensives. We're the intense people. We're the too much people. We're the go like hell and rest like the dead people, right? We work in phase. I say we have a phasic work cycle, right? So we work really hard and then we rest really hard. And then we work really hard and then we rest really hard. And that phasic work cycle is often misinterpreted by people who are not intensives. So as I started to think about this, I was like, okay, by casting a shadow, like anytime you create a thing, it casts a shadow. And where it casts the shadow is the other half of it's the balance point. So if there are intensives, there must be something else that is not intensive. And eventually I named that expansive. And so we have the intensives at one end and the expansives at the other end.
Interesting.
So expansives are people who are moderate and even. They like things predictable. They don't like surprises. They don't have big emotions. They like, their emotional range is pretty narrow, and they're happy with it like that. They don't want a big emotional range. You know, in the coaching world, often we say, find your passion. And that's not fair to expansives, because a lot of expansives don't have one and don't want one. They're like, I just want my life to be fine. I want to get up. I want to do a job that I don't object to. I want to come home. I want to take the kids to soccer. I want to mow the lawn. Like, I want a life that's fine. Why do you have to have like all this big stuff going on? Right? And intensives are bored if that's all they've got. And if you do not, here's the key with intensives. If you do not keep yourself busy as an intensive, if you don't keep yourself engaged and interested and moving and And if you aren't giving yourself that kind of emotional peak experience periodically, you will stir shit. You will cause trouble just to have something interesting happen.
We would cause the peaks.
Yeah. If you can, we cause them anyway, right? We cause them when we get super interested in something. We cause them when we get into a new relationship, whether it's a friendly or a romantic or a professional relationship, right? When we find something to be interested in, we cause them anyway. But we will cause trouble if we can't find a way to do it nicely.
That's really fascinating. I'm kind of feeling like you're talking about me.
I might be.
And I will experience being around certain people that are not that way. And it's like, I think I've literally said, okay, you don't want to get in trouble being yourself, you know, just by being who I am, which is silly, you know?
Right. But that's what happens. So part of the premise of my book is that the United States and Canada and most of the other, there are two kinds of British colonial, it gets complicated fast, but there are two kinds of British colonial territories, right? There are places like the United States and Canada where the British plan was to wipe out everybody who existed there and kind of impose themselves on what they considered a blank slate, because the people who were there they didn't see as people, right? So the colonialist genocidal atrocities that were visited upon this continent are part of that picture. And then there are countries like India where they arrived, but they couldn't, like there were just too many Indians and they were too well developed. And so they had to create an interaction. They tried something similar, but they had to ultimately work with the Indians. So India has a different experience, and certain other parts of what was the British Empire have a different experience. But I'll stick with the United States and Canada because that's closest to home. So what happened was, when the British attempted mass genocide and attempted to impose their will on everybody, British culture, the segment of British culture that was involved in that process really valued expansive qualities, really valued, you know, celebrate with a cup of tea, mourn with a cup of tea, and if you're going to have a big emotion, please leave the room until you're ready to come back and act civilized, right?
Right.
What is act civilized code for?
Behave, or?
But what does behave mean in that context?
Do what I want you to do, or help me?
But specifically, it means act expansive, right? It means be quiet, be still, be moderate, right? Those things were lifted up as the ideal, and anything that wasn't the ideal was less than. It was also, because we're using civilized, right? What's the opposite of civilized? Uncivilized or savage, right? So anybody who was intensive was less than. And everybody was trained to be more and more expansive. Right. And if you were expansive, you were allowed to rise up. It was also seen as more genteel. So if you were expansive, you were allowed to rise up through the ranks socially. If you were light-skinned and an immigrant, like the Irish, the Italians, and the Jews all came over, and all of them had much more intensive, friendly cultural spaces, right? If we look at what we think of like a New York Italian or a New York Jewish way of being, it's more intensive, way more intensive than the standard. And if you could act more expansive and your skin wasn't too dark, because that was a whole lawsuit thing that happened with an Indian guy in the 1800s. But if your skin was light enough and you could act more expansive, you were allowed to rise up through the social ranks. If either of those things wasn't true, then you couldn't. And so then we ended up with the class correlations with intensiveness and expansiveness as well. So it's a fascinating and complicated thing. But where you start out is expansiveness is privileged in this country. That's the better way to be. And that's something we inherited from British colonialism.
Wow.
And so if you're expansive, then you're leadership material. If you're expansive, then you're management material. And so then we can see really easily how people who are in the margins in one of a bunch of different ways suddenly aren't leadership material, aren't there's no reason that that should be the case. So we start out with, I'm in intensive and I keep getting rejected for it and it's driving me up a wall. And we end up with the entire world has this bias, or not the entire world, but a lot of the world has this bias, and this bias is largely a result of British colonialism. And what can we do to counteract this bias? Because right now we're leaving a lot of talent on the table.
When I was in coaching early on, and we did, there's several different tests, but one of them was like a Myers-Briggs. And what blew my mind was that I saw this group of people and I didn't see them as being different personality types. I always thought there was something that I was doing that was causing this person to try to roll me over, you know, and so no, that's just a driver personality. And as soon as we took that test, it was the most bizarre thing. This room like came to life in a different way that I'd never experienced before, seeing that distinction. And it sounds like it's a similar thing, the intensive and the expansive, because I could see that. I could see people that are both ways. That's very cool.
Right. What I love about this, and it's funny because in so many parts of my life, I have a lot of trouble speaking, like sort of bragging about my stuff. But this thing has changed so many lives that I can't help it. Because what I love about it is that it's a super simple, it's not like Myers-Briggs, in that Myers-Briggs has 16 personality types.
Right.
This is one axis with two ends, and you can be anywhere on the continuum, but it's one axis with two ends.
Yeah, that's easier to get.
Right. So if you're at the zero end, from 0 to 5, you're an expansive, and if you're from 5 to 10, you're an intensive. Yeah. And people kept asking me for an assessment. So I have one on the book's website. The book's website is you'renot-too-much.com. On the book's website, I do have an assessment. The challenge is that it's not normed because I'm not a social scientist and I don't have access to university resources to do that kind of work. If somebody out there is a social scientist and wants to work with me to create an actual normed assessment, that's fine. But otherwise, people are finding it really useful.
Cool.
And that's why I published. You know, people were. I had one person who was heavily in the medical publishing field say, "Well, how can you do that? You can't just go and publish a book." And I said, "But I just did," which is classic intensive. I was like, "This is useful. I have it. I'm not going to wait around for some publishing house to decide they like what I'm doing."
I make up that there are, you know, the yin and the yang. So each one of these kind of personality traits has traits that are beneficial and maybe a dark side.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the interesting thing about this book is that I wrote it in 1,000-word chunks, and then I went and compiled those 1,000-word chunks. And then when I gave it to my editor, because I did hire an editor, she broke it back. She found the chunks that I had mushed together and she put it back apart. So, you know, the sections are understanding intensiveness, other people, work, the care and feeding of your intensive brain, and saving the world. And the thing with the care and feeding of your intensive brain is that it does talk about it because we tend to spin up more. And my conjecture, I'm not a therapist, I don't have a doctorate, I can't say anything about psychology officially, but my experience is that a lot of people who identify as intensives seem to also have diagnoses of either depression or anxiety or both.
Interesting.
And that's because our brains are just going. And then we interlace that with the cultural rejection that's common for so many of us. Not everybody, but a lot of people grow up thinking that they're wrong, grow up thinking that if they weren't like they are, the people around them wouldn't be having such a hard time, right? And so we try to squish ourselves into a littler box, and that's just not healthy. And so we get depressed, we get anxious, we get socially anxious because we feel like we're always breaking social rules that we don't even know what they are. And then when we finally figure a little bit of that out, we're like, oh, well, this feels like crap. We come into adulthood. What do? We start using drugs. We start using other things. We try to numb out because it's really uncomfortable to feel like you can't be yourself. Yeah. So that's one side of it, but that's not really the really challenging side. The really challenging side are people who move into positions of leadership, who are intensives and who don't have ethics or morals.
Yeah.
So leaving aside current world leadership, we have examples like Hitler. I believe that Hitler was an intensive. and that he used his intensiveness. We tend to be highly charismatic. We tend to be very persuasive, even when there are no facts to back us up. We tend to know we're right without needing to go to the facts. And we tend to mistrust statistics because we know we can bend them to our will, and so we know everyone can bend them to their will. And so we tend to go much more on what we feel. And if you're diligent about maintaining an ethical and moral framework, that's okay. Because I might feel something is true or feel something needs to happen, but if I can see that it's going to have a profoundly negative consequence for a large swath of humanity, I'm not going to do it. Whereas Hitler used his intensiveness to justify doing it.
Gotcha.
So on the one hand, we have people like Richard Branson, who's doing immensely good things with his intensiveness. Nobody will convince me. I know he hasn't taken my assessment, but nobody will convince me that he's not an intensive. And on the other hand, we have people like Hitler, who did horrific, atrocious, like mind-blowingly bad things with his intensiveness.
Yeah.
So I believe part of our compelling moral responsibility, and this is where it comes back to the faith in which I'm grounded, right? The part of our responsibility as intensives is to understand our intensiveness and to take care of ourselves in the ways that we need to be taken care of so that we don't effectively, turn to the dark side.
Sure.
It's very much a Star Wars use the Force, Luke, like, and appropriately enough today is May the 4th.
Well, we all have something good to offer. I think everybody has that within them. The story is about the two dogs or the two wolves inside of us and which one we feed. And if we see ourselves as an intensive, that we know we want to nourish, the side that's for the good.
Right. Exactly. I also believe that all humans have a seed of good inside them, and it's possible to starve that seed.
Absolutely.
And so we have this obligation to find out who we are, what we need, what we want, what our skills are, what we can offer the world, and then to really go after it. Expansives don't have to do that in the same way. I mean, there's certainly possibility for expansives to leave a moral high ground and go somewhere else. But expansives are less pointy and therefore less dangerous. Expansives can be absolutely lethal in the wrong position, right? Because expansives are the ones who are great at follow through. Expansives are the ones who are great at systems and charts and graphs. Intensives can envision the system, but implementation, like we're a little shaky on follow through. We need help. Intensives and expansives really have to work together for the world to work. But expansives, if you get a solid expansive behind a charismatic, really terrible leader, that's literally a deadly combination.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's not that expansives don't have to examine their moral ground. It's just that expansives don't have to worry that they're going to be point person usually on something awful.
Gotcha.
Because expansives are not typically point person. Expansives are really good at lots of things. Being point person, especially on a new idea, is not a typically expansive activity.
Because it's new territory? Is that?
Expansives are less interested in novelty. Expansives are more interested in solidity and reliability and consistency. So if we're talking about computer companies, IBM is expansive and Google is intensive. So, an expansive is going to say, well, let's look at the data, let's do a study, let's take our time, let's make sure all the ducks are in a row, and then we're going to launch, when we've already got the program well developed and we've already vetted it with all of these people and we've tested it with, 3 different focus groups, then we're going to launch, right? Whereas an intensive company is going to be like, you have an idea, great, let's put it out there and see what happens.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. The intensives are jump off the cliff and build the parachute on the way down, people. And expansives are like, have you checked the wind speed? Are you sure you have a parachute? Did you forget the nylon? Is it going to be dark when you hit the ground? What's on the ground? Those are tigers and pointy rocks. Do you think this is really a good idea? Because even if you hit slowly, the tigers and pointy rocks are not going to be comfy. Can we like talk about a different location? Meanwhile, the intensive has already jumped off the cliff, and the expensive is like. If you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, Samwise Gamgee is your classic expansive, and Frodo is your intensive.
I will share that with my daughter because she knows those characters really well. Go ahead.
Samwise is always supporting. So Frodo is like adventuring and going, striking off into the dark cave with nothing but a glowing sword, right? And Samwise is like, I don't think this is a very good idea, Mr. Frodo, sir. But then he goes because expansives are motivated by things like duty and responsibility. And intensives are not motivated by duty and responsibility. Intensives are motivated by things like adventure and novelty and glory.
Tell me a little bit more about, there's a couple other things that you had mentioned earlier, leadership coach and consultant, power pivot, power and leadership.
Right, so I'm an intensive, so I have a lot of things going. And I'm about a 9 on my own scale, out of 10. And so I do leadership coaching and consulting. I use this intensive expansive framework as the basis for my coaching and consulting. I'll come into an organization and I'll take a look. Who is your organizational leader? What is the predominant habit of the organization as a whole, right? Because we know that systems have their own habits. And then who do we have as individuals in the rest of the group, whether it's the team you're managing or the team that manages you or the entire company, whatever it is. And then we'll look at that through a lot of different lenses. You know, how does that change how you interact with your team? If you're an intensive leader and your team is expansive, then you're going to want to give them a lot of advance notice that you wouldn't ordinarily give them. You're not going to want to drop new ideas right in the middle because that's like dropping a bomb. You know, you're going to want to have space for them to do research and time for them to do research, and you're going to want to figure out what you're going to do while they're doing that research so you don't lose interest and change subjects. Because there's very little worse than saying to an expensive, I'm interested in doing this project, and the expensive says, okay, I'm going to go research it, come back in 2 months, and you come back in 2 months, or they come to you in 2 months and say, did you forget about this project? And you say, oh yeah, I moved on to this other completely different thing. And they're like, what am I supposed to do with this research? Oh, I don't know, I don't care about that anymore, right? So when you're hiring people, you want to make sure you have an intensive or expansive who's the right type for the job. You want to make sure that your job description doesn't ask for somebody who's both intensive and expansive. That's a really big one. We want somebody visionary who's great with details. No, that's not a thing. You can't have it. You'll find someone who can fake it until they're under stress, and that's terrible. So I come into organizations or work with individuals. I often work with owners of small businesses who are just beginning to staff up, or of startups that are beginning to staff up, so that they can think about this stuff from the very beginning. Because remember what I said about systems theory, right? You don't want to build a system with bad DNA, because it's very hard to get rid of the bad DNA. There are studies about families with addiction histories where the last person actively addicted was 200 years ago, and they're still acting out the patterns, even though nobody remembers that the act of addiction even happened until you really ask them about it. So you don't want to build a company with bad DNA. You want to build a company with clean DNA from the beginning. And so I do that, and then of course everything's connected to everything. So once we get started working, and we have this as the underpinning, but then we do all of that leadership development, all of the, what does it feel like to be a leader? What does it feel like to move into leadership? People are messier than computers. I work with a lot of tech professionals, and they're like, but the computer just does what I tell it. I'm like, I know, humans aren't like that. So that's the leadership development and coaching. That's the bulk of what I do right now.
The Intensive Institutes of San Francisco Power Pivot. Oh, and that is what you were just talking about right now. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the Intensives Institute is where I base my work. So I started the Intensives Institute, and that's the branding that wraps around all of this leadership development and coaching and the workshops that I can offer and that kind of thing.
Cool.
And then Power Pivot is a Patreon project that I started out sort of as an outgrowth of the Intensives Institute. So Power Pivot is part of the Intensives Institute. But what we're talking about specifically on Power Pivot, which is essays, and it'll be conversations as well, as, although I'm early enough in the launch that I haven't made any recordings yet, but it's coming. what we're talking about in Power Pivot is ways that power appears, ways that power is modified. We're talking about power and things like race and class. We're power and privilege. We're talking about power and pleasure. We're talking about how does having power transform you? How does losing power transform you? What happens when you didn't have power and then you come to power? Like, that transition can be really complicated and hard and really deepen your identity. So all of that stuff around power, we need to talk about power openly and honestly. I like having power. I think power is awesome. I am not someone who believes that power corrupts necessarily. But I think in order for it to not corrupt, we have to be talking about it. We have to be talking about the moral implications of having power, of giving someone power, of taking power. What's the difference between, when somebody gives you power willingly and when you take it and they didn't give you permission for it? So many interesting topics. So that's at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/LeelaS. And folks can sign up to support that on a $1 or $5 a month basis, which is really, my goal with that is to make it accessible so that we can have these conversations and so they can be out there.
What is next for you? Do you have trainings or any presentations, or what's going on for you?
I am working right now on a training that I'm going to bring to Utah. That I'm bringing to Utah in conjunction with a couple of my clients there. We haven't set a date or a time. It'll probably be toward the end of the summer. And I'm going to be doing specifically the SIF, the Sinha Intensive Expansive Framework, for marketing and sales. So we're going to be looking at how it affects your customer, how it affects you, how it affects your interactions with your customers. If your customers are primarily intensives, you want one kind of marketing. If your customers are primarily expansives, you want another kind of marketing. How could you overwhelm people versus how could you keep up with them? So we'll be talking about that for 3.5 days. 3 or 3.5. We haven't decided how we're going to distribute the hours yet in the greater Salt Lake area. So that I'm super excited about that. And then, and the other thing is I'm looking for speaking gigs. So if folks think this would be interesting to introduce to your company or to another organization you're part of, I'm definitely interested in having that conversation. And nice. I can travel if we can figure out how to work out the finances of that. So.
All right, cool. So how do our listeners get a hold of you?
You can reach me through my website, intensivesinstitute.com. My email address that I'm using right now, it might shift soon, but my email address that I'm using right now is leela@leelasinha.com. So that's the easiest way to email me. If you're friends with me on Facebook, you can also message me on Facebook. But if you message me more than just hi, because if you message me just hi, I'll think you're a troll. Folks can also find me on Twitter. My Twitter presence is primarily personal. It doesn't have a lot of this material, but if you tweet at me, my Twitter handle is @Leela Sinha. And if you tweet to me, I'll get right back to you. I tend to be on my phone a lot. So those are the best ways to reach me, is email, letter, and through my website, or through you. People can contact you, and
That's correct. We will put in the show notes all the links of how to find you and your book and what is going on in your world. And thank you, Leela, so much for being here. It is wonderful to see you again.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. I love talking about this stuff, and I love giving the tools to people who can use them.
Nice. And please come back, and we'd love to have you on the show again.
It would be a delight.
Thank you for joining us today with Awaken the Mind.
Relax.
Hosted by David Juhas.
Awaken the mind. You need to understand. If you can't, you must. And if you must, you can. Now that I got you, let me put you in a trance. Got you feeling hypnotic. Your mind, let me massage it. Your thoughts are getting quiet. Your stress subsiding. You starting to see images, but it ain't no mirages. Think it's time to calibrate. Take a breath and concentrate. Get into your subconscious. Time to feel the energy, the brain waves. Let's go deep into your memory. Beware of self. Let the worries melt. All you see is you and you don't see no one else. Auditory, digital, talking to yourself. It might seem bizarre, a feeling you never felt. This is your time to shine. Awaken the mind. The NLP and hypnosis guide. Yeah.